Recently, I watched the film Darker Star. I was going to put the preposition there, the Darker Star, but I think the film's actually entitled Darker Star. It's directed by Joe Wright and stars Gary Oldman as Winston Churchill, and it's been critically acclaimed. There's been reports that in some cinemas people actually have spontaneously stood up in a standing ovation, which is quite remarkable for a modern film. You hear about that sort of thing from some old films, but from a modern film, that's quite something. Certainly, when I went to see it, there were a few tears. I sort of looked around at the end, and I could definitely see the lady beside me. She definitely had tears in her eyes, and I was moved. I was originally going to do a film review, but I thought actually what could be interesting is to talk a bit about the subject, Winston Churchill. A truly remarkable man, whatever way you look at him. One of the most important figures in British history, in European history, and I would argue, yes, in world history. Um, in 2002, we had a survey on Great Britons, people who influenced our history. And that was a cross range of fields: politics, business, well, maybe not so much business, but politics, science, engineering, social reformers, entertainers. And not very surprisingly, Winston Churchill came in at number one. Number two was Isambard Kingdom Brunel, the great engineer. Number three was Princess Diana. But Churchill was number one. And he almost always comes in at the number one place when prime ministers are ranked. Prime ministers in this country are not evaluated quite as much as American presidents. There haven't been as many comparative studies, but there has been a few. I know of one at the University of Leeds. Mori, the research institute, has carried out several studies. Churchill very often makes it either at the top of this or near the top. Other prime ministers that tend to do pretty well is William Ewart Gladstone, William Pitt the Younger, Clement Attlee. Um, Margaret Thatcher doesn't usually get to the top spot, but she does quite well. Tony Blair usually ranks around 16th spot. Robert Walpole, despite the corruption of the time, tends to rank quite high. Um, but generally, the top three spots are usually Winston Churchill, William Ewart Gladstone, and David Lloyd George. Lloyd George, of course, was the other great wartime leader. There hasn't been as many films about Lloyd George. Churchill has been depicted many times by many actors. Off the top of my head, and I may omit some people here without meaning to. Robert Hardy, um, Albert Finney. I thought Finney done a very good Churchill. Um, Actually, there was another Churchill film released last year as well, um, in which he was played by the Scottish actor Brian Cox, um, and Timothy Spall. And I'm sure there'll be other people. I'm literally just remembering this off the top of my head. Gary Oldman. Now, I must admit, I wasn't. Although obviously I've heard of Gary Oldman. I've seen one or two of his films. I'm not overly familiar with his work. I knew he played Dracula in Bram Stoker's Dracula. Other than that, I honestly haven't seen that many of his performances, which might come as a surprise because he is a big A-list actor. But physically, in terms of resemblance, he looks nothing like Churchill, whereas other actors kind of look a bit Churchillian. Bob Hoskins, by the way, was another actor who played Churchill, and I thought he'd done a decent job. Um, I'll just speak briefly about the film and about Oldman's portrayal. Well, Gary Oldman got a renowned Japanese makeup artist. He recommended him to the film director, who was Joe Wright of Atonement fame. Joe Wright got wide praise for his very moving Dunkirk scene in the film Atonement, and he has a certain directional style which is I find quite interesting, and I think he's definitely a director to watch. Gary Oldman really really took the role of Churchill. And I think what was interesting about his portrayal, a lot of actors who take on Churchill, and he's been portrayed something like, I counted 35 times. That's a lot of portrayals. A lot of actors who take him on tend to show the grumpy Churchill. Churchill was known for his bad temper, and for being a rather gruff sort of old man. But what is often forgotten, at least in the film portrayals of Churchill, the screen portrayals, is that he had a great wit and a great sense of humour. I have a whole book here, which is entirely about that. The wicked wit of Winston Churchill. I could quote any number of phrases that are attributed to Churchill. Here's just one off the top of my head. Cats look down on men, dogs look up to men, but pigs see us as equal. And there was a few of these thrown into the film, which really brought out Winston Churchill's famous wit. I think it's one thing that kept it going, actually. Perhaps it was a coping mechanism because he suffered from serious depression throughout his life and he lived to the age of 90. He called it his black dog periods. So the film, I thought that Oldman's portrayal was very, very good. I mean, I thought I wouldn't go so far as to say it's the best portrayal of Churchill I've ever seen. I think it's very good, but I really have to watch other Churchill films again, or I should say films depicting Churchill, and compare and contrast. I feel Albert Finney done a pretty good Churchill as well. Um, Low Oldman is definitely near the top, if not at the top. I mean, he got the he got the tone right, the intonation that Churchill showed. You know, I listened to the famous On the Beach's speech, and it's not easy to get that pitch. The thing about Churchill, it's very easy, I think, to fall into stereotypes, and I think for an actor playing such a famous role, I guess it would be the same for actors playing Napoleon or Abraham Lincoln or other famous characters in history. It would be quite easy to fall into stereotypes. Now we do know what Churchill sounds like. There's plenty of recordings of him. He died in 1965, so there's plenty of recordings of him. Um, the oldest surviving recording of Churchill is when he was only 35, back in 1909. He was given a speech as part of the people's budget of that year. And he sounds a bit more upper crust, if anything, since then. So interestingly, Churchill's voice evolved over the years in much the way that Queen Elizabeth II has. She sounds somewhat less like the Queen than she did in 1952. What I mean by that is she sounds certainly not common, but she sounds a little bit more, or a little bit less, dare I say it, posh. Churchill was born in a palace, so there's no doubt he was born into privilege. The Churchill family is a very prominent family in the British aristocracy. A distant ancestor of Churchill, Lord Churchill, or the Duke of Marlborough, as he was also known, was the great hero of the Battle of Blenheim during the War of the Spanish Succession, which was a major war in European politics, excuse me, a major battle in European politics. There was a film about Churchill, The Gathering Storm, television film, which is about the lead up to World War II and Churchill warning about the German rearmaments program and so on. And the opening of that film was very well done. It shows Churchill going to the battlefield. He was a great historian, Winston Churchill, going to the battlefield to write about his ancestor. And it shows him sort of having this sort of imagining what the battle must have been like. And Marlborough turning around and sort of almost looking in profile at Churchill, and Churchill being inspired by that. So he came from a very prestigious family. He was half American. His mother was an American, and he, I believe, got American citizenship at one point. Lord Randolph Churchill, his father, was a very prominent political figure. Um, Even before World War II, Churchill was already a famous figure. He'd been a prominent war correspondent in the Mahdist War in Sudan in the 1880s and 1890s. And he had served in a number of cabinet positions. I believe he got his first seat in 1900, unless I'm mistaken, it was the Oldham West by election. He had served as a Liberal. He then switched to the Tories, back to the Liberals, and then once again to the Tories. Um, so Churchill had long been a controversial figure, even before his wilderness years. Um, in 1915, he was heavily criticised for his role in the Dardanelles campaign, which was catastrophic in terms of British casualties. Um, Many soldiers died not just from enemy action, but from the horrendous conditions from dysentery. British casualties in the Dardanelles were 140,000. I should say British Empire casualties, including Anzac troops. 140,000. It was a catastrophic campaign. I've been doing research tonight on Victorian conflicts, and according to my research, 87,000 British casualties in all of Queen Victoria's colonialist wars combined. The Dardanelles campaign, 140,000. So that gives you an idea of what it was like. What I want to talk about really is the character and legacy of Winston Churchill, because what has happened since this film came out, because it's been critically acclaimed, because Gary Oldman's being praised, there's been this backlash from left wing revisionists who really want to basically say Churchill was a racist and that's it. Let's not celebrate him. This is a very this is a very important thing to discuss, because when we talk about great historical figures, biographies are often likely to be contentious, with the exception where you have personality cults and blind adulation. Now, we don't have that with Winston Churchill in the UK, and I wouldn't support that, because I'm dead set against all personality cults. But I don't believe that is the situation in this country. Churchill is admired, and certainly many people, especially of the older generations, do really admire Winston Churchill. But it's important to recognize that what he done in World War II, his leadership, his doggedness, in the film, a big emphasis actually, and probably the secondary character in the film, apart from Clementine Churchill, who's played by Kristen Scott Thomas, who is herself shown as a strong figure. But perhaps the second most important role in the film is played by, or is the character of Lord Halifax, who was one of the critics of Churchill. The Tories wanted him to be the next leader when Chamberlain was basically dying from poor health, which was sort of kept a secret. But Chamberlain resigned, of course, after the phony war. And the Tories widely wanted Lord Halifax to be their leader. He was widely respected in the party. He was seen as very capable. Um, so the film really showed the frictions between Halifax and Churchill, and specifically about Halifax's proposal that Mussolini, of all people, act as a mediator between Britain and Germany. Um, and it showed very fiery cabinet meetings in the Cabinet War Office, which was underground. Actually, it's now the Churchill War Cabinet Museum. Um, but I think the film was very effective at getting that suspense. Another quite important role that's given in the film is, I forget her name now, but the young woman who was Churchill's secretary. And what I liked about the film is it didn't entirely show Churchill in a flattering light. I mean, well, I think it was virtually the first scene, or pretty near the first scene. It showed her coming. She just got the job as Churchill's typist, and it showed him dictating his notes to her, and basically he let off. He yelled at her for not reciting back to him exactly as he wanted. Churchill was had a bit of a stutter throughout his life. He always found it difficult to pronounce the letter S. So in the film, it shows him basically lambasting this young woman. Now, you imagine you're 23 years old. You go into the presence of Winston Spencer Churchill, who already, even before his premiership, was a very famous figure within British politics. It would be pretty intimidating. Um, and I like the fact that the film showed this side. It showed that human side. It showed a rather unpleasant side, quite frankly. Anyway, he sort of indirectly reconciled with her, I suppose you could call it a half apology, on the prompting of his wife. I believe that Clementine Churchill was a very formidable woman. I think you'd have to be married to someone like Winston Churchill for years. There's no indication at all that Churchill was ever unfaithful to her. I believe he did love her deeply, thinking of the human side of the man. But to get back to my point, there's been this sort of revisionist attitude that because Churchill had some very contentious points, and I am going to address those, that therefore he should be not. There's been talk of pulling down Churchill's statues. There was a famed pub in London that was actually vandalised because they had a portrait of Churchill and his famous cigar signature. It was vandalised. I find that very sad. Here's my take. I believe that someone like Winston Churchill, it's absolutely valid to analyse his legacy, to discuss and debate his legacy. But I think that when the revisionists left, and this is overwhelmingly left, it's been coming from the Guardian and the Independent, tried to say, well, because he had this negative side, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, then let's just ignore his positive side. Or that's too simplistic. Let's ignore the fact that his leadership saved this country from outright invasion. The fact of the matter is, you needed an arrogant, dogged force of personality to lead this country during those years. If you had someone who was meek and gentle and polite, we would not have got through World War II. I have no doubt that Churchill was a very difficult man to work with. He was bad tempered, he was profoundly rude, he was arrogant. In normal circumstances, these would be very negative personality traits. But in the midst of World War II, I do think that we do need to consider the context. And I think a certain degree of doggedness, dare I say it, even a degree of authoritarianism, was necessary. So when the revisionist left want to say that Churchill's negative side was entirely bad, and that's the only thing we should talk about, I think they are underestimating exactly what he'd done for this country. Now, his negative side, there's no question about it. Churchill held racist views. He held racist views towards parts of the British Empire. He was a staunch imperialist, as were many of the gentlemen of his day, many of the political establishment. Churchill was an unapologetic imperialist, but as an extension of that, he did hold racist views. I mean, he described Gandhi. Incidentally, today marks exactly 70 days, 70 years since Gandhi's assassination. That's not here or there, it's just a coincidence. But he once he's been quoted as describing Gandhi as a subversive in his gang of Hindus. So Churchill spoke in very politically incorrect terms. It's been often argued that there's no way Winston Churchill would be elected today. Indeed, it should be remembered he wasn't elected directly in 1940. He ascended to the leadership in 1940. There's no general election in that year. So there are a lot of contradictions about Churchill. On one hand, this was a man who intervened in World War II, not just to protect this country, but to stand up against the scourge of fascist totalitarianism, an ideology that sent millions of Jewish people and others to the gas chambers. So the contradiction there, obviously, is this racist intervened in a war to stand up against a fascist ideology that was killing people and on an industrial scale based on notions of white supremacy. So yes, there's an obvious contradiction there. But those are the historic facts. That is what Churchill done. And I really think people need to think about that when they're demonizing Churchill. I've no problem with criticism of Churchill. There were attitudes that he held that are absolutely impossible to condone. There were things he proposed that, by today's standards, would be utterly shocking. He once proposed using gassing the Kurds during insurrection in Iraq in I believe it was the 20s. Um, he was a personification, I guess you could say, of the arrogance of the British Empire. Um, and in his second term, in which really he was he was being supported because of the legacy of him being the war leader. In reality, his second term was mediocre at best. If Churchill was solely judged as a prime minister on his second term, he would definitely be in the average rankings as opposed to great. His second term wasn't outstanding, although it was the term, I'm talking 1951 to 1955, in which some of his most famous speeches were made. He coined the term superpower, he coined the term Iron Curtain. Um, I mean, there were things done during that period that are certainly morally dubious. The overthrow of the democratic government of Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran, for example. So, if you take away World War II and look at Churchill's legacy before and after, Churchill is definitely a very controversial figure. But my argument would be that World War II was such an important event geopolitically that the threat that we faced, not just as a nation, but the threat the world faced, was so grave and so profound that to ignore that and to say, oh, well, yeah, Churchill done that, but let's look only at the fact he did have racist views, etc., I think is to really, firstly, it's to do a disservice to the personal courage he showed. Churchill risked his reputation, he risked his health, mentally and physically. He could have refused to go to the palace in 1940. Let's not forget he was an elderly man at that point. He was in his late 60s and he was not in great health. But the truth is, had it not been for his leadership, we might have seen a very different situation in this country. Now, I think maybe at some point we would have overthrown any sort of fascist dictatorship, but it would have meant years of occupation. That never happened. And it was fundamentally down to one man and his leadership. Of course, the courage of British troops um, is absolutely was absolutely part of it as well. But on the political side of things, Churchill's leadership was paramount. That is why he is a great man, and that is why I think it would be wrong to bring down statues of him and to try and totally revise his history. What I would argue is, yes, let's be honest about Churchill's darker side. Let's be honest about the fact he probably wasn't a very nice man. But let's also be honest about the fact that he was a remarkable man, he was an inspiring man, and he did literally save millions of lives with his leadership of this country in World War II. It should also be remembered that when Churchill died, there was international tributes. This was a man who really was revered around the world by millions of people, not just in Britain. And I think it is fair to say he was one of the most remarkable people in history. And we'll probably never see the like of him again. We've had some pretty formidable leaders since then: Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, Clement Attlee. But I don't think we'll ever see someone on the scale of Winston Churchill. And I think that as a nation, we need to recognize that. On the domestic front, I don't believe he was a great prime minister. I believe he would have been on the regressive side of the Conservative Party on a lot of fundamental issues: universal health care, the welfare state, and so on. Churchill was on the wrong side of history. But after 1945, even though he lost that election, which many international observers might find strange, the reason for that was that people were tired of the war. They respected Churchill, and they certainly saw him as the hero of the war, but they were tired of the war and they connected his name with the war. Clement Attlee was a fantastic peacetime domestic prime minister. The sort of social programs he enacted have survived to this day. Attlee was also a remarkable figure, but a totally different personality. Far more humble, far less assuming. Very different personalities, but both very important figures. I do think there should probably be more focus on Clement Attlee on screen, But I mean, Attlee, that's perhaps my only criticism of this film. I think Joe Wright could have given the actor playing Attlee a bit more screen time. He showed him at the start, and that was really it. Even though the film did show that Attlee was the coalition, wartime coalition partner, I think there could have been a little bit more made of that in the film. Um, but then again, it's probably harder to make a film about Clement Attlee simply because his personality wasn't as striking, it wasn't as exciting, it wasn't as bold. I do think today Churchill would absolutely be pilloried by the politically correct segments of the press. I don't think he would be elected today. This might sound strange, but probably the closest politician we have to Churchill is Boris Johnson. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying Boris Johnson is the equivalent of Winston Churchill, certainly not. But with Boris Johnson, you have a larger than life figure who's not afraid to be controversial, who's politically incorrect, and who seems to always survive controversy. So, in that sense, he's probably our closest equivalent. He's also half American, like Churchill, and he's written a book about Churchill, so that's interesting. Certainly, of all the political figures around now, can you imagine Johnson as Churchill, Corbyn as Attlee? I don't know. Just throwing it out there. Okay, thank you for watching. That's my thoughts on Winston Spencer Churchill. Let's not forget this man saved the country. That's why I think it would be wrong to tear down statues of him. So, yes, let's be honest about his legacy. It's fine to criticise his darker side, but let's not forget that he did, whatever way you look at it, save this country from occupation, from the darkest totalitarian fascist regime of the 20th century.